We'll start out at client level in the MVC application. We'll get to the Angular application after this. The OpenID Connect middleware has a redirect to identity provider notification. We've used that before when adding the identity token as a hint for logging out. One of these redirect to identity provider requests is the authentication request, fired right before requests to the authorization endpoint are triggered. That's where we can add Twofactor as an ACR values parameter. And that's already it at MVC level. The rest of the logic is at identity server level. And you can already guess that will start in the custom user service. There's a method we can use for this, post authenticate async. This gets triggered after the user has authenticated with identity server but before a token is returned to the client. The ideal place for two-factor authentication, depending on what the client asked for through the ACR values parameter. So this is the place where we'll need to either use a partial login and redirect to a page where the user can input a valid 2FA code, or if he already did that, simply continue. So we'll need a way to generate and keep two-factor authentication codes for the user. Let me add an empty service. Let's name it two-factor token service. And let me copy paste it in so we can have a look. Now, I don't have a server laying around here to send text to phones, so please consider this demo code, but it does show the principles we need. We need a way to generate a two-factor code for a specific subject, and we need a way to notify the user about this. That can be through a text message, for example. For the demo, we'll use a dummy code. We save that code in a dictionary. That dictionary has the subject as key and the two-factor code class instance as value. That two-factor code class instance, well, that contains the generated code. It contains a date until which the code can be verified, because you don't want that code to be valid for too long. And it contains a value that states if the user already verified this code. Then we need a way to verify that two-factor code for a specific subject after he has passed in the code on a custom page. So we find the subject in the dictionary and we check if the code can still be verified. We check if the code inputted matches the code in our dictionary, and if that's the case, we set the isVerified value to true. Lastly, we'll also need a method to check if the user has already verified the code. We do that by finding the user in the dictionary and checking the isVerified value. These three methods are all we need. So with that, we can now go back to the custom user service. So what do we need to do here? First, we check the ACR values from the sign-in message. If this doesn't contain a 2FA value, we don't require two-factor authentication, so we can just continue. If it does require two-factor authentication, we're going to check if a user has already verified its two-factor code. If that's the case, we can continue. If the user hasn't inputted a valid two-factor code yet, we need to generate one and we need to redirect. That redirection is again a partial login, just as we did in the previous demo. This time we redirect to a two-factor authentication page. So let's create that one. Let's start out by creating a two-factor authentication controller. Just as before, we'll also need a model. Let's add that. It's a very simple model. It only contains the code the user can input on the view. So that view, that's the next thing we should create. It's a very simple view. It has one field where the user can input his two-factor authentication code and a continue button. Onto the controller again. This should look familiar. We check if we have a partially signed in user. If we don't, we show an error, and if we do, we return the view passing in an instance of our two-factor authentication model. When the user presses the continue button, we again check if we have a partially signed in user and try to verify that code for the partially signed in user. If the code is valid, we can redirect to where we left off. That'll be the post authenticate async method. If it's not a valid code, we show an error. And that should be it. Let's build and run this. But first, let me set a few breakpoints. within the redirect to identity provider notification at the level of our MVC application. Apparently, an authentication request has been fired, so we are going to pass in Twofactor into the ACR values parameter dictionary. Let me log in, and within the post authenticate async method. Let's have a look at that ACR values list. That now indeed contains our Twofactor string. This is the first time we hit this, so the has verified two-factor code should return false. Indeed it does, so we generate the two-factor code and we redirect to our custom page. And there we go. The user should now have received a two-factor authentication code via text message or via mail. In our case, we're using a dummy code, 123, so let's input that. And we're already back in our post authenticate async method. The two-factor code has been verified. So this time, has verified two-factor code should return true. And there we go. And we're logged in into our application after having provided a valid two-factor authentication code. There was one more thing, the Angular application. Let's go to that one. Let's open up common.services where we configured the OIDC token manager. We'll need to pass an ACR value of Twofactor here as well. We can do that by setting the ACR values field to Twofactor. And that's it. Let's make sure we start up the Angular app this time. And we redirect to the security token service. This time, let's try using Facebook login. We are asked for our two-factor authentication code. And we're logged in into our Angular application. That's it for this demo.